When I'm starting a portrait project, I like to use an X grid to try and get all the main elements in the right place, because with a commission, it's really important that I try and get a likeness. So getting the drawing right is a big part of that, and I like to spend time on my drawing. Here's my wooden dowel, and I just want to double check on my photo, like how big is his nose compared to the height of his mouth? Like how tall? Almost the same height. So let's just see. Oh, good. I've got it pretty well in there. That's where the highlight's going to go, right in there. How wide are his eyes compared to each other? That one on the right is just a slight bit bigger. Okay. His mouth. Let's go for the width of his mouth. And what's the angle? That's kind of a downward angle, which I did not get in there. So I'm just gonna, and actually I think that I need to angle that nose a little bit more too. So let's angle that nose down. And I think I'm going to do that mouth again. I'm just gonna erase that with a little bit of water. The nice part about using water-soluble graphite is I can just wash that sucker off. Let's get that mouth in there again. And I want to see where everything lines up. It lines up with the inside of that nostril. There. There's a little bit of a bulb, and then it goes down. And it just goes above the halfway point here. So, okay, so I want to keep that. If you really want to protect your drawing and not wash it out with color, you can also spray this before you start painting with a fixable or a workable fixative. Just a spray, just lightly spray it down, and that way your drawing will stay. I'm going to start by prepping the background, and I know in this piece I really want to keep that nice dark background so that the highlighted area of his face will really glow against it, because the darker something is against a light, the more impact it can have with that contrast. And I'm going to pretend there's no chair or anything like that. I'm just going to put an abstracted background in, and I've done some tests to kind of see layers of transparent acrylic and in places using some airbrush medium to create layers of rich color. So that's what I want to do right now. I'm going to use, based on my tests, I'm going to use the Hooker's Green. I'm going to put just a little bit of airbrush medium into it to make it a little bit more flowy or a little less viscous. And I'm just going to go around this entire background. And I'm using a number 6 synthetic Mongoose Filbert brush. I like the Filberts because I like that rounded shape. It feels more organic to me. I don't have any water in this paint. I'm just using paint with a little bit of airbrush medium. And I did not wet my brush first. This is acrylic, by the way. And I like M.Graham Paint. You saw that or maybe you haven't seen it yet. I'll show it to you. The tubes. It's a little less viscous than golden, although I really like golden. They have good color. And you'll notice if you are a fan of Hooker's Green, the golden version is very dark in value, and this one is a little lighter and more organic. And so I like to use this one for backgrounds such as this. The golden Hooker's Green is my favorite when I need to make rich, dark, black shades of green. But this is perfect, I think, for what I'm doing today. So I'm just going to go around my drawing, but I can actually creep up into and over part of my drawing, because that way, when I paint his little face, I can paint it over top of the background and not have to worry about any gaps in between. And I don't want to be too precious with this paint. This is just the background. I want it to be like I said, abstracted, nothing too fussy. But I do want to play with, like I said, transparency. And a little, just tiny bit more of that flowing medium. The airbrush medium is fantastic. You can add it to your water too, and it'll help your paint dry just a smidge slower, although I never worry about trying to retard the drying time of my paint. I personally like the fast dry time. It allows me to make all kinds of layering effects. So if I want to use a slow drying paint, that's when I switch to my oil. Okay, so I'm just going to leave this, let this dry, and then come back with another layer on top of it. Okay, so it's pretty dry. It's been a couple of minutes, and now I'm going to apply another coat of color with the same brush. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a transparent red iron oxide, a little bit of airbrush medium. And because, you know, red, and this is a brownish red, and green, you know, they really are complementary colors. They really will kind of make a dark, but this is such a vibrant color too. It should just enrich in that background in places, especially where I want it to be dark. And then I can put more green over top of it, but this layering of transparent and opaque are just going to be, hopefully, like I said, more rich in color. And I'll let that dry and then do some more of the green on top and just keep going back and forth. If you want to, you can also play with other effects. I just dripped some airbrush medium down on top of this after it was kind of semi-dry, and I'm just gonna see what happens. I'm gonna lay down some paper towel and just kind of soak up those airbrush medium drops. And they just kind of carved through little holes back to that green. So it gives me a little bit of a bokeh effect, like in a camera. So the green layer was really dry, and I just did that on top. And then I can go again, like I said, over top of it. Looks like part of this is where the green wasn't fully dry. So it's lifted up and there's some white canvas showing through, but that's okay. I'll let all this sit and then I'll do another layer. Now I've squeezed out a little bit of Viridian hue on my palette, and Viridian is the green I'm going to use with some of the skin tones. So I'm going to keep that on my palette, and I've got a little bit more of this iron oxide, this red iron oxide, and when I mix them together, you can see I get a really nice dark neutral. That's quite a nice dark. So I'm going to use that for some of the really dark areas. I'll mix up a little bit more of it. But when it comes to my painting, I don't want to be just all dark, so I'll probably put some lighter areas in there too. But for now, I'm just going to get some of these darks in. That way I can put the light on top. So I'm going to start with some of this really dark color. And just kind of come in, and again, just adding layers, covering up some of that stuff that peeled off before. I'm especially going to put some of this dark right around his face. And maybe down in here too. And again, like I did before, if I want to, I can also sprinkle some of this airbrush medium on here and do that bokeh effect again. But this time, having the light show through. Let's just see what that does. Yeah, it's just nice and subtle. It's giving me these nice rich areas of dark over light, but just giving me these dots of color kind of showing through as well. And in fact, I could even do that with some other color. And I just kind of decided that I really want to do a little bit of a splatter effect. I don't know why, just for fun. So I'm going to take some of this reddish brown and I'm going to add a bunch of airbrush medium to it. And I'm just going to splatter some of that brownish color. It's going to be subtle because it's not a real contrast and it's a transparent color, but just to give some interest. So the bulk of my portrait colors are titanium white, yellow ochre. I'm using a Quinacridone rose, but you could also use a Quinacridone red. I just wanted a cool, transparent red. I have Viridian green, which is a very transparent green, which will help kind of dull down the intensity of the pinks for the skin. And I've also got a cadmium red light, which is an orangey warm red and very opaque. And that's just for some of the warmer areas of color. I'm just going to grab this photo and put it right near me. The main thing here is right now I just want to start mixing some color, and I could have done some experiments as well just to make sure I get the right color. But the bulk of the color, especially for babies, they have such beautiful, perfect skin, is going to be white, and it's going to have some yellow ochre in it. And he's a bit backlit, and all the light on his face, for the most part, I think is reflected light. If I just do white and yellow ochre, I can see, oh, it's getting quite close to that highlight color. I can just hold it over my photo, but we got to get darker for the skin. So I'm going to take a little bit of the Quin Rose and a tiny bit of that Viridian green. I'm going to start mixing these together and then keep assessing as I go along with these three colors. Yellow ochre and, well, white is the main bit of color. Yellow ochre is going to be the next most populous color, followed by the Quin Rose and then a little bit of that Viridian color. This is more of that light tone up there, but I still want to get that darker for the shadow part of his face. And there really are some warm tones in that shadow, and you can see how things are a little different in areas. Pink, kind of more yellowy, maybe a little bit of even some purpley tones in there where his eyebrows are. Very warm reds in his ears. So I just adjust, I get a main color going, and I have to constantly remix and just try and get as close as I can. Still kind of light. It's a good light though. We're going to get a little darker yet. Now I might go too far on this, but I can always add more white to it again and just keep mixing. So a lot of my time is spent just trying to get the right colors and the right value. And just adding white is not the best way to just lighten your color, because what that will do is just make it too pastel-y. You always have to add a little bit of yellow, I think, anytime you add white to a color. Okay, the value is getting right in here for some of these darker areas. There's a lot of green down here in that neck bouncing off of his shirt. But when I squint my eyes and hold this over top, it's starting to disappear. So I'm getting pretty close to some of these shadow areas, but I think I want them to be a little bit more pinkish. Yeah, touch more green just to dull it down a little bit. And when I'm mixing, I always want to kind of corral the color back in so it doesn't get too wide and too thin, because with acrylic paint, it dries so dang fast. I'll lighten it just a little bit. Okay, I'm going to start here, and I can adjust and add more pink tones as needed, but this is a good base to start. Again, I'm using a Filbert brush. This time I'm going to start with the number 2. This is just an 8x8 board, so it's fairly small. And what I want to do is just start getting in some of these main dark areas. I'm just using straight paint. And I'm going to go a little bit bigger with the color than I need to, because I know I can always put more color on top, and the color I'm using is fairly opaque. So I will be able to cover as much as I need to. But right now I'm just kind of putting in the tones that I see. In fact, I'm just going to go over the eyes for the most part. I'll put in some of that dark detail in a bit. With babies especially, I don't want to make any of the creases too dark. If I make them too dark, what will happen is it'll make the baby look artificially aged. Little Nicky. Okay, now as I go towards the cheeks, I'm going to add a little bit more red to the color, that Quinacridone rose, so that these dark areas are a little bit pinker. But it still feels like it's part of the same color family, so it's not out of the realm of possibility that you'd see that color in there. It's very subtle, but I'm going to add some of that red as well to the forehead, that pinker color. And you might not be able to see a big difference here. It is so subtle. As I get towards the forehead, that little divot right there that we sketched out, I'm going to add a little bit more green just to dull it down a smidge. And it's got some of that green because you're really, what's happening is you're seeing through to the blood vessels underneath. I'm just going to take that same grayish kind of duller skin tone and paint it in here for some of that hair. I want to keep my brush strokes fairly loose and soft where they overlap that background. And the way I do that is I make sure that my brush isn't too wet. It's fairly dry. And then just kind of gently brush it over top of that background area. And while I have this color, I'll just put it anywhere else I think I see it. Okay, the whole area under his chin it's quite a bit more yellowy greenish, because again, he's wearing a green shirt, and so it's a reflected light. Actually, I'm just going to paint this whole area the darker color, and then I can dry brush some of the lighter values of his neck on top of it later. I just put some burnt umber and some ultramarine blue down on my palette, because for me, black I can just mix with that brown and that blue together. And that way I can really lean it one way or another, like warmer with more brown or cooler with more blue. And I'm just using a size 0 Filbert right now, just to kind of get in some darks. And we'll refine these shapes. I just want to get in the worst of it. And inside the mouth, it's really quite warm. So I'm taking that warm red, that cadmium red light with some blue and a little bit of brown. Kind of get a nice dark, kind of a burgundy rust color to put in the darks. Because if I just did solid black, it would feel too dark and dingy. I want to make sure we give him life. Again, I'm always just kind of comparing what I'm seeing in the photo in terms of color mixing. So I'm just always comparing what's happening in the photo to what I'm mixing by holding up my paintbrush every now and then over top of that photo. Now the darks of the ears are just really going to be quite red. In fact, almost just this red with a little bit of white in some of these translucent areas where the ear is a little thinner and light is showing through because this is backlit. So I'm just going to paint that in nice and warm. And then as we get farther in to the ear, still using that warm red, but I'm just going to dull it down a little bit. Maybe that was too much with the green. So I can really keep this ear nice and warm. Now for the eyebrows. The eyebrows, I think, you know, if I'm using this mix of green with the warm red, let me see how close I'm getting here to the right color. Obviously too dark, so I add some white. Pretty close. I'm gonna add a little bit of yellow to it. A little bit more red, because as I add white, the color is really going to gray down. I think that's pretty close. So I'm going to use that mix of colors. It's not super dark. I mean, I can see the eyebrows, obviously, but I don't want them to be too dark. This is the thing with babies. They really have such gentle curves in their faces that it's not super obvious. Take some of my skin tone and add it to this just to kind of help transition between the eyebrows and the rest of the face. And as the eyebrow moves towards the right, it's getting a little bit lighter too, so we'll keep the dark tone where it belongs, right in this middle area here. And every time I wash my brush, I just kind of wipe it off with my paper towel, just so it's not super wet. I don't want to add any water into this area, really. At least not yet. Okay, so now I've got the main shadows established, and I'll keep revising. I go back and forth so much when I'm painting, but I want to put in some of the clothes so that all the skin can lay over top of it. I've just added a permanent green light to my palette, and that's the color I see in here, and I can add some yellow if needed, my yellow ochre, to dull it, because yellow ochre is such an earthy yellow. It would help dull the green down a little bit. But let's see, let's go back to my size 2 filbert. And I'm just going to start putting in some color, and I know that I still need to establish shadow and highlight, but I just want to get the greens in there to begin. I'm not worried about separating the shirt from the scarf yet either. They're all the same color. I'll do that a little later. I'm going to put in some of his arm color, and just like everything else, I've got to green up part of that arm color because it's really getting that reflected light from his shirt. And I'll deal with the highlights a little bit later. But now that I've got the shirt in, I'm going to let that dry, and while I do, I'm going to start getting all over color on the head. So I'm going to have to lighten up my skin tone here a little bit. Go back to my main skin color because it was a nice big blob. It stayed fairly wet, even though everything else has dried completely now. And as I add the white, I really need to add that yellow as well. Because that white, as I said, it really can just cool down the tone of, or the tint of this color too much. We don't want to cool it down too much. He's really got a yellowy tone because of all the greens around him. And because it's warmer in shadow there. And that little bit of green to help keep the color not too vibrant. Let's keep lightening it up a little bit. We're getting pretty close here. And in places like the chin or the forehead or the cheeks, might still be a little bit more pinkish. So I'm going to just add some more of that pink, and I'm just going to go in to this cheek, taking this lighter value and just dry brushing over top of the pink that's already there. So that way they look like they have a soft edge. And again, it's just really making sure that that brush, I push and wiggle into it. It's got lots of paint, but it's not super wet, kind of dry. And that way I can just go over it softly. More of that yellowy skin tone for the chin, with a little bit more of the pink in the center. So I'll go back in and add that here in a sec. So that pink, I'm going to put right in that center. Just going to slightly darken this up just a little bit. For this right-hand side, or left-hand side, sorry. Which is turned away from the light, so it really does get a little bit of shadow. Mix in a little bit of that pinkish color too for as I move up towards the cheeks. Again, I don't want a lot of strong contrast yet. I'm really trying to keep things soft and in between the transitions, and I can always adjust later as necessary or as I feel it needs to be. Right above the mouth, the tones can be a little bit of this greenish, kind of a yellowy. I find the muzzle area is usually a little bit more of kind of those yellowy, greeny tones. And there'll be some highlights, of course, but for now, just like I said, not a lot of contrast so that things are going to go into place nicely together with each other. noticing more pink tones as we go up on that forehead. So I'm just going to start pinking that up a little bit more, especially in the middle area there. So we're little by little getting rid of the white space. And then that'll give me a good basis to continue working the painting. I'm just lightening up the color as I continue working up this forehead. And I'm going to place a block of color where I need it, and then go in with dry brush and just kind of soften where it touches the rest of the head. And anytime I need more paint, don't be tempted to go to water to mix more paint. Always mix a new batch if you're all out, but you want to stay with paint, not water. Water is not your friend with acrylics, even though we like to think that it is. Water just makes the color really watered down and translucent. And what we want to do with acrylic is really paint with the paints. If you're going to water things down, use that airbrush medium. It's a much better way to make your paint more viscous, or less viscous, pardon me. I can't think and talk at the same time clearly. Just want to get a nice reddish color for the bottom of his nose. And I'll put in more dark tones underneath his nose for shadows a little bit later, but for now I just want to get that darker bottom half in. I gotta make it a little bit rosier, especially in here. And maybe in the crooks as well. Even though I'm keeping everything super soft and not very high contrast yet, I still want to make sure I'm really thinking critically about what I'm doing and where. Because there's still going to be highlights that are going to go on top of this nose, but the bottom of his nose is fairly shadowed and dark. And then there's also going to be a little bit of reflected light here underneath. But I'll get that a little bit later. Right now I just want to get the bottom part of that nose. So he's looking a little squidgy. A little bit too dark and not warm enough, so I'm going to add a little bit of red, that warm red, some yellow, and just go over it. Now I'm going to take a break here in a minute, but what I'm going to do in the meantime is I'm just going to get rid of some of this white space. So I'm using my small brush, and I want to mix a lip color, and I'm going to use the warm red and white, and I'm going to mix that cool red in with it, along with that yellow. Sorry, not the white. I mixed yellow, white. Oh, that's pretty close, but I want to dull it with some green. And it's that mix of those two reds that's going to give me that nice lip color, I think. Good. And it's going to be quite dark underneath this area here, so I'm going to have to go back in. And I'm going to use a smaller brush for this really small area on the top of the lip because I am working so miniature on this 8x8 canvas. And right in the middle, he kind of comes up. He's got this little, just this little widow's peak of his lip, or Cupid peak, or whatever you call it. So I'll paint that in. But I got to keep it soft, so I'm going to dry off this brush and just go in and kind of squidge up the edges a little bit so it's not too perfect. And it gets a little bit more red as it goes down. So I'm gonna make sure I keep that, because that gives him that warm, kind of youthful lip. Little pumpkin. And his eyes, I've definitely, they look too squinty here right now, but they'll loosen up when I go in there with the paint. So even though he is half Asian, his eyes really aren't that squinty. But the first pass, I'm always just going to get the shapes in, get the values and colors in, and then refine as I go. Lighten up the color towards the bottom a little bit. You can always add a little bit of a highlight later as well. And I think I'm going to need more skin tone right up against that lip. There we go, peanut. A little bit of a lighter tone on the ear. But I also want it to be a little bit pinker than I have it. So I'm going to take some of that lip color and just add it here. The ears are always going to have a little bit more warmth to them, even in the more opaque parts. And I'm still sticking with some of the darker values, and I'll lighten up later. So this is all really still kind of an underpainting base. And then I'll paint on top of it. Using nice dry brush edges when I meet other colors, so I don't go too out of control. And now, where the highlight is, I'm just going to start putting some in. But I'm still not going to go as light as it's going to get. I'm just going to start to establish it a little bit. Again, just using a nice soft edge. And I really want to get some of those hair tone colors, and it's really kind of grayed out. So I'm going to use that green and reddish mixture to kind of lighten it. There. I'm just going to dry brush some of that hair color. Where I see little patches that are longer. And with that hair color and some of the skin tone as well, I'm just going to go in and put in some of the grays of his eyes. And then I'll go back in with the dark again later, but just, this is the white of his eye, effectively. It's very much a dark tone. The whites of the eyes are rarely pure white. Just the highlight a lot of times is. Going to make it nice and red in the corner there. Mix of the two reds, I should say. It's a lot of back and forth for me with layering and kind of, you know, adjusting color and tone. And especially in a portrait where I want it to be soft. So I think what I'm going to do now, I'm going to put the crease of the arm in and I'm going to take a little break. Then I'll come back to it. And normally, I mean, a small painting like this, I could just paint it all in one session, but I've been experiencing that long COVID and my energy levels just won't allow me to do everything all at once. So I'll leave that for now. Oops, actually, let's get a little bit of more of a crease down here at the bottom of that chin. I'm just going to lighten it up by kind of fading it out with my fingertip there. Okay, so I'm on day 2, so I'm going to need to get a new palette. Okay, I've let this sit for a little while, and I think now what I'm going to work on is his shirt, get all those details done before I move on to the rest of his face again. So I'm just going to get some of those colors mixed up. I'm using the permanent green light as my main green in this. And let's start with the darker values first. So I'm going to mix a little bit of the black. For me, that's blue and brown mixed together. I'm going to mix that into my green. And that's going to give me a nice warm green if I have more brown than blue. So I'm going to use my number 2 Filbert. I'm just going to start putting in some of the darker values here. And really, it helps to just squint your eyes and just look for the big shapes. Okay, I'm going to lighten this up a little bit more for some of these other shadows that are a little softer. And I'm going big with my shadows because I know I can always put the light on top a little bit later. And then I'm just going to start adjusting some of those colors. Obviously, where the black mixes in with the green, I get a dull color. So I'm going to make sure that I'm not mixing any of my lighter values for my green with that. So I'm going to start here. And as soon as I add the white, the color becomes kind of minty. So I'm just going to add a tiny bit of the yellow to keep the color a little bit warmer. I'm just going to keep my brush strokes fairly soft because I don't want too much detail in this part of his portrait. Again, I'm just keeping those edges really soft, so I'm just kind of dry brushing, keeping them maybe looking a little bit messy, but that's again going to keep that focus on the face. If I just keep this really kind of soft and light and fancy free. And I am going to put in the rough shape of those stars, but I'm going to keep those a little bit less contrasted than what they are in the picture. So I'm not going to make them quite as light. Take a mix of that blackish color and add a little bit more blue, just to kind of give myself some grayish stars. And then I can lighten them up later where I want to. But this way in shadow, the stars would be shaded anyway. And so all I have to do is go in and add the highlights. And this way I'm not being too precious with the stars. I'm kind of putting the hint of them in without being too exacting. And again, that way they don't become the focal point. And same thing for the inside of this collar. I'm going to use the gray first, and then I can lighten it up where I need to. And I just want to keep those edges soft. And then maybe take a little bit of the white with a little bit of warmth to it and do the brightest highlights on top of that. I find that if I have at least 3 values in any area, so a dark, a mid-tone, and a light, even just those 3 values give me enough of information to be able to kind of imply a shape that's plausible. I'm going to keep working on the features that are dark. And I will probably have to come in and darken them up again later. I like to layer, as you can tell. I'm going to start with the eyes. I'm going to use this black, this mixture of blue and brown, to just kind of come in and make sure that I've got all the little elements. And I'm still going to keep it fairly soft. There's no real water on this brush, just paint. I'm going to just reinforce some of the main elements, and then I can go in and around it with more lighter colors and give highlights and such. But for now, just kind of getting some of those really dark elements in. And that's mainly the lash line and the eye itself. Now I'm going to start working with a smaller round brush, and just because I'm working so small, always scale your brushes to the size of your canvas. But what I want to do here is I'm going to take the 2 reds, some yellow and some white, with a tiny bit of my Viridian green, and just start establishing more of the nose, really trying to get the shape in. And I'm just going to keep checking against my photo. Again, I'll take a color that I've mixed and just kind of press it up against and see how close am I to what I see. Nice and pink. Those pink tones on that nose really help bring it to life. And then we're going to get lighter. And as I get lighter, I might have to add a little bit more yellow to start to pick out some of the actual values as I go around. And if I go too far, well, I should have kept some of my darker value. So this is a good lesson. Keep some of your darks as well, so you can kind of go back and forth as needed. And again, now that I got the bulk of that dark in, I'm just going to get a little lighter and just continue. And I can really kind of shape this brush. The nice thing about a round brush, I can shape it with the paint as I go. Wipe off my brush anytime I want to have a little less paint on there. And if I want to dry brush the edges to keep them soft. And it gets even lighter. There's a really nice, bright, light highlight along the top edges here. I'm just going to keep in there. Sweetheart. And then just dry brush around the edges of them to keep it nice and soft. I'm going to take some of that mid-tone and just kind of, actually maybe pink it up a little bit more. And just go below into this tip of the nose here. Right where it curves down to the center. Just giving him a little bit more of a rosy tinge there. And with some of that rosy tinge, I'm just going to go back into the lips too. And oops, that's too light. The minute you put it on there, you can see it. So that's the nice thing about painting with opaque color. You can always go back over it. Gosh, there's something about painting people. You really kind of fall in love with them. And this is actually my cousin's baby. And I haven't been able to meet him yet because of COVID, and he lives in Toronto, so it's quite a ways away. So hopefully one of these days soon I'll get out there and get to meet him in person. Because he is a little pumpkin. Look at him. All right, some of the grays with the skin tone. Go back into the eyes here a little bit, fashioning a point. Just to pop in a little bit of light. And there's no real light on that left edge of that left eye. Now the gums. He's got a little bit of a gum showing, and it's quite pale compared to the lip. It's kind of a pinky tone. Let's see if this works. That's a little too light. You can tell right off the bat, so I'm going to darken that up. We don't want it to look like teeth. It's not teeth. It's just his gums. That's a little better. And he does have a couple of little teeth down there in the bottom. So I'm going to use my gray and pink mixture, gray and skin tone mixture, so that the teeth aren't too bright. And just get those suckers in there, little baby teeth. Okay, so I'm going to keep refining. I want to get some more of this reddish color and make sure I go into the inside of the eye with it. And I want to make sure it's dark enough, because when I look at the picture, it looks really dark. So I got to stay dark. And same over here too. I'm just going to rim his eyes a little bit with this red as well. I cannot do this sweet boy justice. He is so dang cute. I just can't stand it. But that's always the way with portraits, you know. you just do your best and know that probably you're not going to capture their likeness completely. So I always tell my customers that I'll do my best to get a feeling of them, but I'm not going to try and get a perfect likeness because I know that's impossible. That's just impossible. Almost impossible. So I'm going to use my number 2 Filbert again, and I'm going to start getting some more skin tones, and I just got to get a little bit lighter and brighter. So let's mix up our base skin tone color, red and yellow, with a little bit of green, and then a bunch of white. So we'll start here. And I'm really going to want to do some dry brushing wherever I meet the existing skin tones. Now I'm going to start off a little bit darker here. Make sure my brush is nice and dry. Get a new paper towel if you need one. I like these blue towels. They're soft towels. They just seem to last longer. Okay, good. So this is pretty close to what I had up here before, just a little bit darker. And so this second layer now is just going to cover a lot more. So I'm just going to go in here. Again, dry brush where I hit the existing skin tone. And this second coat now just is a little bit thicker, so it just covers a lot better. And I creep up on my brush a little bit more now that I'm towards the end stages as needed. I take my time, it's not a race, I don't need to hurry. And I'm just really smoothing out some of the skin tone right now. Just dry brushing some of that light value where needed. So really pushing and wiggling that brush in the color, wiping it off, and that gives me a nice color to go in and dry brush with. And the nice thing about this Filbert brush is I can use the edge to get smaller marks. Squinting your eyes really helps. It really helps you see the values for what they are, where they're happening. And because I have this base tone here, when I go over it, all I'm doing really is just lightening up areas. And that just really pops things out nicely. Dry brushing around the edge of that face just to give it a bit of a glow. It's just soft. I want to keep it nice and soft. Let me get even more yellowy for the neck. Necks, they really do have a lot of yellow in them, but especially because he's wearing this green shirt and handkerchief, there's a lot of yellow. Okay, now I'm going to mix with my palette knife, because the palette knife allows me to mix a bigger batch. I'm going to mix some more light value skin. And it's got to be quite light, so there's going to be a lot of white in this. little green, some yellow. I'm going to need more yellow as I add more white. I always grab from the edge of the blob of paint, and that allows me to get just a little bit and yet still retain a nice clean batch of paint to use next. Getting quite light. Let's get some more yellow. I'm going to check it against my picture for some of these highlights. I'm going to use that yellowy tone, as well as here, where we want to keep lightening a little bit. Dry brushing, and this is just going to give him a little bit more glow. And this is still the yellowy color, so I'm not going to use it as much. I'm going to put more pink in it before I continue. Wiping off my brush in between really well by squeezing it between my paper towels so that I can have hardly anything in there that I can just rub around to softly add that color. Okay, so now I'm going to add some more red to that color. So I'm going to start with this dry brush haziness where the highlight is thickest, but then I'll go back in with thicker paint where that highlight is. So I'm starting by keeping it fairly dry so I can just give a haze of the highlight. And then I'll go in and add the thicker paint inside as well. He's got these little eyebrows that are very pale and they're catching the light. So I'm giving a little glow with dry brush right here to kind of give that impression of the light hitting the hairs right there. Like this is a soft edge here where it comes in on the cheek. But right here under the eye, that's a little bit more of a hard edge where that highlight hits. And right along the edge of his face. Really helping to accent that backlighting. I'm going to darken this up. I'm going to darken this up. His face. Really helping to accent that backlighting. So this gives you that idea of how I would approach a portrait, but of course everybody has a different way of working. No one way is the right way, and this is more representational. But I love acrylic. I love how powerful it can be in terms of layering and allowing you to create these effects right off the get-go. So I'm really honored and grateful to you all for having me here today. And I hope this has been of interest. So please feel free to ask any questions you have. And of course, you can also email me later at abanderkaart@gmail.com. I'm sure they'll send that out for you guys. And happy painting.